about what has just been happening in Afghanistan. But first, this being International Working Women's Month, really International Working Women's Day is in just a few days, I would like to open and dedicate this talk to a remarkable, courageous, and very accomplished Afghan woman. Her name is Anahita I hope I can pronounce it correctly, Ratebzad. She was the founder of the Democratic Organization of Women of Afghanistan. She was born in 1930, and I believe she is still alive. She was the first woman doctor in Afghanistan, and she was a Marxist. She was a founder of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, which are referred to as the PDPA. When in 1965, women for the first time ran for public office in Afghanistan, she was one of the first 4 women to be elected to the Afghan parliament. Now, the government of Afghanistan had historically been neutral in the Cold War ever since the Russian Revolution. Didn't want to become a base against the Soviet Union. But by 1978, there was enormous pressure from the US for Afghanistan to move to the right. Why that time in particular? For one thing, because there was a revolution going on in Iran, and the US was losing a very important electronic eavesdropping base in Iran that they used to spy on the Soviet Union. And they wanted to move it to Afghanistan, and they wanted to get the Afghan government to go along with that. That same period, by the way, there were revolutions going on in Ethiopia, in Yemen, and generally U.S. imperialism, and Nicaragua, right? And probably others, I'm just thinking of that particular area. But in general, the U.S. was very worried, and they were trying to, line up countries wherever they could behind them. So the government in Afghanistan was pressured to repress the PDPA, the People's Democratic Party. And they actually threw all the leaders in jail in 1978. Now, what happened was that there was a rebellion within the ranks of the military. And they broke into the prison with a tank, broke open the jail, let the leaders out, and proceeded to go with them to overthrow the government. So in 1978, there was a revolution in Afghanistan, a progressive revolution. And this brave woman, Anahita Ratebzad, was one of the leaders of that revolution. And she became deputy head of state from 1980 to 1986. Now you'll understand in a minute why I'm bringing all this up. That government that she was a very leading member of immediately moved to free women from legal bondage by banning the bride price, so that women were no longer objects to be sold by their fathers to the highest bidder, but could marry whoever they chose. The new government built schools and kindergartens so that women could get out of the home and work if they wanted to, or become teachers or students. And they did, and many women became teachers. And they went to the countryside in a massive literacy campaign. According to a paper that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, a scholarly publication, right, in 1998, women eventually, in that period, became 70% of the teachers in Afghanistan, 50% of the civil servants, and 40% of the doctors in Kabul. By the time before the Taliban took over, in other words, before that government, that progressive government was brought down, and I'll get to the reason that it was brought down. Now, you know, we hear a lot from the U.S. and people like Hillary Clinton that the U.S. has been over in Afghanistan for the last 10 years with troops because they want to help with women's rights. But what did they do when there was a government in power that was doing everything it could to advance women's rights? Well, what they did was the CIA organized an army against the revolution, beginning in 1979. Now, the reason that they gave publicly, once it came out that the CIA was doing this, and that didn't happen for a little while, was they said, well, we had to do it because the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. But that's a total lie, because they did it before the Soviet Union was ever in Afghanistan. They did it in 1979. The Soviet Union didn't bring troops into Afghanistan until 1980. Now, on what authority do I say this, that that's when it all started? Just because of what Zbigniew Brzezinski admitted years later, who was Carter's national security advisor, which I was about to get to. He had been President Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. And he bragged in an interview much later, 1998. I'll read you exactly what he said. According to the official version of history, CIA aid to the Mujahideen, that's what they called the army that they built, the Mujahideen, the liberators, began during 1980. That is to say, after the Soviet army invaded Afghanistan on December 24th, 1979. But the reality, said Brzezinski, secretly guarded until now, he said, is completely otherwise. Indeed, it was July 3rd, 1979, that President Carter signed the first directive for secret aid to the opponents of the pro-Soviet regime in Kabul. And that very day, I wrote a note to the president in which I explained to him that, in my opinion, this aid was going to induce a Soviet military intervention. End of quote. So in other words, the U.S. very deliberately drew the USSR into a war in Afghanistan and then said that they went to Afghanistan because they had to counter a Soviet invasion. Why did the USSR intervene? Well, first of all, because they were asked to by the progressive Afghan government, which was under attack from these CIA organized forces that were assassinating teachers, government officials, blowing up things, and so on. But the USSR also had military strategic reasons to resist the U.S. in Afghanistan. And I'm alluding particularly to this question of the U.S. wanting to build a base in Afghanistan to do eavesdropping, electronic eavesdropping on the Soviet Union, which would give them valuable military and economic information. And that was written about by Robert Gates, who was a former CIA director, in his book From the Shadows. He said that the U.S. was, in 1979, looking at Afghanistan as a possible site for this base to replace one, he said, to replace one in Iran, which had been closed down by the Iranian Revolution. So it was pressure by the U.S. on the previous Afghan government that had helped to precipitate the revolution.